Well, I'm here today to talk about King David. We're going to do a sermon series on the life of King David. I'm starting with 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, the passage that describes when David became a king. Now, first, let's pause for a moment because we live in a modern age when we talk about presidents and prime ministers. To speak of kings and queens sounds rather archaic, a throwback to an ancient time. And you might be inclined to say, we don't really care today about someone who becomes a king. Actually, we do just a little. If you think about it, here in America, we're still like so much of the rest of the world. We have a tendency to watch the news when something happens in England with the royal family. Like recently, a couple that decides they're going to break away from the official royal duties and try to be ordinary as they know how. And that's a news story this week. If there's a royal wedding, we're all glued to the TV and watching it and all the fanfare. And of course, when the day comes for someone to be crowned, we'll be watching. Truth is, in our lifetime, we're going to see something that's really unusual. Because for so many years, England has been ruled by the Queen of England. But it won't be much longer, and we'll see the coronation of a new king. Whether it be the son, Charles, or whether it be the grandson, William, we're going to see the coronation of a king. And all eyes will be turned towards that and watch with amazement and wonder. You know, that's the way it was for David. When David became king, that was big news all around. Now, when I throw the name David out there to you, I can't imagine anybody in this audience doesn't know who David is. If you got any church connection, you know about David. And of course, you know the most famous story that involved David. In fact, you just look at the picture of it, and it says it all, the story of David and Goliath. There was Goliath, that giant of a man, standing on a battlefield with the Philistines. He challenged someone from Israel, a champion, to step forward. Let's go one-on-one, and to the victor belongs the whole war. And there's not a single soldier from Saul's army that would step forth and confront Goliath. Well, except for the shepherd boy, David. He said, I'll do it. And you remember how he did it? 5 stones and a sling. And he threw the stone and hit the giant head, knocked him down, and won a great victory on that day, the story of David and Goliath. Thereafter, it became legendary, even a part of culture today. We still talk about David and Goliath when someone small takes on someone great. And some of you are old enough, you may remember even back in the early 60s, 1960s, a little TV show put on by Lutherans, and it was about Davy and Goliath. It was claymation, little boy and his talking dog, and they told stories. And the names, David and Goliath, they have just stuck with us. We know that story. Now, folks, if that's what you know about David, if that's pretty much all that you know about David, there's so much more to tell than just the story of David and Goliath. In fact, I'm not going to tell that story because you already know it, but also because I got a treat for you. February the 9th, mark that date. On Sunday evening, February the 9th, meet back here in the Family Life Center because we got a special program that evening. Got someone coming in. Saw the program last year. I did, several others did. We loved it. Said, let's bring it to First Church, and we will. It's the story of David and Goliath. It's told with song and with skits and with a lot of humor as well as a lot of serious reflection. It'll be a fun evening as we tell that story and learn lessons from the story of David and Goliath. We'll do that. But I want to move on to some other stories because there's so much more. Are you aware that David gets more space in the Bible than any other character except Jesus himself? 61 chapters tell the story of David. Now, 61 chapters, that covers half of 1 Samuel, all of 2 Samuel, a portion of 1 Kings, and all of 1 Chronicles. He gets more space than anybody else telling his story. And there's so many stories to tell. That's why this series that I present, I'm going to start with David as the king and tell you some of the stories of David as king and see what lessons we can learn. But we begin at the beginning when he was crowned to be king. Let me tell you this about David. First, he was the second king of Israel. I mean, he may be the great king that you and I remember, but he wasn't number one. He was number 2 as far as the order of the kings. He came after King Saul. Now, if you remember the story well, you may recall that King Saul was the one that the people selected. That's who they wanted. He looked good. He was a leader, et cetera, et cetera. King Saul wasn't necessarily God's choice, but he was the people's choice, and he was their first king. Now, for David to become king, that's going to be a challenge. He's going to have to work at it, because the way you become king is you're the son of a king. You inherit the throne from your father, and David is not Saul's son. He's not in the family at all. Now, the heir to the throne was a guy named Jonathan. Jonathan and David grew up side by side. They were best friends. And Jonathan knew that one day David would take the throne, not him. But you see, Jonathan, who was the heir apparent, died in battle. His father died in that same conflict. And that left a void and emptiness, because he was the new king, and he's no longer there. Now who? Well, they looked at the sons of Saul, and some of the tribes of Israel, they surrounded Ishbosheth. They thought, well, he could be the new king, and so they rallied behind him. But other tribes said, no, we like David a lot better. He's a better leader. He's a warrior, because of the Goliath story. And so it was, the tribes were split between David and the house of Saul. And our text tells us they had a civil war for the next 7 years. For 7 years, it was tribe against tribe, Israelites against Israelite, a lot of killing over who's going to be the next king. Now, 7 years later, here's what the text tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 3. It says there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And during those 7 years, David grew stronger. The house of Saul grew weaker. Eventually, David won, and he became the king. But he had to take it away from the family of Saul. Now, when you know that about David, you may say, well, I don't particularly like that. I mean, after all, if that's the way it's supposed to be, if that's the way you pass along a kingdom, I'm not sure I like David coming in there and stealing it away from someone else. Well, while you think about that, let me tell you this. David was God's choice. You see, David was anointed to be king by God himself. Now, that story goes back to 1 Samuel chapter 16, the first time we ever hear the name David. At that time, there was a priest called Samuel. Samuel was one that God spoke to. Now, Samuel's the one that God said, listen, the people are impatient. They don't want to wait for me to raise up a king. I've got my sights on someone, but he's not ready yet. David was just a boy. But in the meantime, they want a king now. They can't wait. So go ahead and let them have their king. But I want you to understand, I've got my sights set on someone else. And so he sent Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. He said, one of those sons of Jesse is the one I want you to anoint, and he'll be the future king. Now, he went in and told Jesse, bring your sons out, because I've got a special calling from God. Lined up 7 boys, from oldest to youngest, from tallest to shortest. Of course, naturally went to the oldest and the tallest, the best and most likely. Waited for God to say something. God said nothing. Samuel reminds God, I'm here, I'm ready to anoint him. And he says, you're looking at the wrong one. You're looking the way people typically look. You look on the outside. You see what a person looks like, and that's how you judge them. But I'm the Lord. I look on the inside at the heart. That's what really counts with people. You and I need to remember that. It's the heart that matters more than anything. And that's not my choice. Now, he moved to number 2, number 3, number 4. As he kept moving, God said nothing. He got to the last one. He said, something's wrong here. You got any more sons? I got one more. David, he's out tending sheep. I didn't assume you mean him. Bring him in. And when David came in, God said, that's the one I'm looking for. That's the one I want. And he anointed David to be the future king. Now, that story began to spread little by little. It took some time, but rumors began to circulate that the prophet Samuel had anointed this shepherd boy David to one day be the king. Now, that rumor made it to the palace. Saul knew about it. It's one of the reasons the story tells us that Saul hated David. He saw him as a threat, a rival to his son Jonathan. He wanted David killed. Jonathan knew it. But Jonathan accepted it as the will of the Lord. This was his best friend, and he said, this is what's going to be. You're going to be the king, and I am not. Others heard it as well. The whole family of Saul, the army heard it, the people heard it, which makes it interesting to me that they fought a civil war for 7 years. I mean, really, if you're fighting against David, you're fighting against the will of God. And why would you do that? That's a good example of resistance is futile. In fact, the leader of the house of Saul, a general by the name of Abner, eventually left and switched sides and went over to David's side, and he explained why. He said, because the Lord has declared that this will be the new king, and we've been resisting against the Lord's will. Now, that's what they did for 7 years. They fought against what God said he wanted. Now, it wasn't just God that wanted David. He was chosen by the people. He was the people's choice. If you listen to the way the story is told in the Old Testament, the people loved David from the very beginning with the Goliath story. That Goliath story was huge. Remember after he killed the giant, and he and the army are coming back home, and as they come back home, they're having a parade, they're celebrating, and somebody in the crowd started a song. Everybody else picked up on it. The song went something like this: Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. Now, first, David killed a giant. That's one, but that was huge, and it so impressed the people that they said, whatever Saul did that was good, David is even better than that. Oh, David, he had the attention of the crowds just because of the Goliath story. But there was more to it than that. There's something about the appearance of David that got everybody's attention. Now, do you remember that famous statue of David done by Michelangelo back in about 1501? When Michelangelo carved that statue of David, what he created was a masterpiece we still talk about today. First, one giant slab of marble. It was about 17 feet high. And as he carved David, he made it very realistic and lifelike as he did the features of David. Now, it's the young David. And Michelangelo did something that was different from what artists before him had done. He changed the story. Because what other artists had done is they showed you the young David after Goliath, standing over Goliath, maybe a sword in his hand, or maybe holding the head of Goliath in his hand, and it was the victory of David over Goliath. Michelangelo backed it up. He portrayed David standing on the battlefield looking at Goliath and thinking to himself, I believe I can do this. I think I can take him. And showing a confidence as he prepared to face this great challenge. And that was his picture of David. Now, Michelangelo also did something else as he did this statue. He used the biblical description of David. And it's not done in just a single verse, but ever so often as the writer is telling the story of David, he pauses and tells you the same thing. He described what David looked like and why the crowds loved him. David is described as handsome, a good-looking fella. He's described as ruddy. That doesn't register you. The word there means a healthy red. That is, he didn't look like he was pale as a ghost. I've been living in a palace all these years. I don't do anything for a living. Oh, no. He looked like an outdoorsman type, healthy skin, red blood flowing. Well, he was a shepherd boy, and he looked healthy and strong. He was described as a good speaker. Put him in front of a microphone, and he could charm the crowd. And he was described as brave and bold. Well, the giant killer. You see, when people saw David, boy, they were attracted to him, and that looked like a future leader. Kind of like our celebrities today. You notice how our culture today still likes those young, attractive celebrities. Could be movie stars, could be music stars, but you let them walk down a red carpet and lights are flashing and everybody's watching. I'm thinking, seriously, you stay up at night and watch award shows to watch people walk in? Well, you do. We're fascinated with those who attract our attention, even just by their look. And David was a celebrity in his day. He was the giant killer who looked like he ought to be a leader of men. Well, for whatever all the reasons were, finally, after 7 years of fighting, it was agreed David will be the new king. And so it was, our text tells us, that the elders, the tribes, all of the people of Israel, they did gather together finally. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1 says, they gathered at Hebron, where David was, and the tribes said, back when Saul was the king, you were the one leading the army. You led the army to victory. He may have gotten the credit, but you were the real leader. And we'd like you to be our king now. Now, they also went on to say, and the Lord himself has declared that you will be the shepherd of Israel. You'll be the new king. Can't go against what God says. And so it says, the elders of the tribes gathered around David, and they anointed him to be their king. That's how David became king. He had to fight for the job. He had to work hard to become the king. Now, what a king he was. because he became the greatest king of Israel. Not just greater than Saul, his predecessor, but you take every king that followed him. David was still the greatest king of Israel. Fact is, he became the gold standard of kings. Thereafter, every time Kings and Chronicles tells the story of a later king, it will always say, and he was a good king. He followed in the path of his father David, or he was an evil king and he did not live up to his father David. David became the standard everyone else was measured by. He was the greatest king of Israel. What made him great? Well, he was a great warrior. Now, Saul himself was a pretty good fighter. That's how he became king. He looked like a fighter, like a leader of an army, and they made him king. But as good as Saul was, David was better than that. Remember that song, Saul, he killed his 1,000, David his 10,000s. Well, actually, David did have great success on the battlefield. After he took down the giant Goliath, Saul had to do something with him, so he put him in charge of a band of men, sent them off to fight. But he had such great success, the next chapter says, he continued to be promoted higher and higher, bigger responsibilities. Finally, it says, 2 chapters later, David was so successful in fighting that he had more success than any officer in all of Saul's army. That's just how profitable he was. Saul didn't like it at all. That's why Saul would sometimes assign David to do what we today would call a suicide mission. Send him behind enemy lines against greater odds, hoping he'd get killed. And yet God blessed David. And David won great victories, even greater because of the circumstances in which he fought. I mean, David was on a roll. He was a great warrior. Not only was he a great warrior, he had a great reign. That is to say, his time as a king was impressive. If we go back to our text, 2 Samuel 5, verse 4 says that David became king. He was 30 years old, and he reigned as king for 40 years. He will live and die at that age 70. Now, I don't know if that impresses you or not, but you put it back in David's day, that was huge. Now, think about it for a moment. David is a warrior king. He's not the type of king to sit back and send his army to fight. He's the type to get in there and fight with them, to lead them in the battle, because that was his nature. He was a warrior king. Now, if you're a warrior king, your life expectancy isn't all that good. You're liable to die in battle, but God preserved David, and he reigned for 40 years, died at age 70 in his bed asleep. Not only that, David had sons, and they were just as ambitious as he was. And so as those sons got older and he got older, ever so often one of those boys would say, it's time for the old man to step aside, and they would lead a rebellion against David. They would fight a war against David. When you've got sons who are trying to assassinate you, that's a pretty good accomplishment if you can reign for 40 years in that kind of situation and then die peacefully at age 70. That's why the writer tells the story of David and gives you the postscript, the ending. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 puts it this way. David reigned for 40 years, and then he died. And when he died at a ripe old age. He was full of days, full of riches, full of honor. David had an exceptional life. He had a great reign because God blessed him. Not only that, but David increased Israel. One of the things David did was took their army, which was pretty good, and he increased the size and the power of the army. They grew so big that they were second to none. There wasn't a nation in the world they were afraid to face, and they faced them all time and time again and won every time. He created a great army. In addition to that, he expanded the borders. Now, back in the days of Moses and Joshua, centuries before, as Joshua was leading the people into the promised land, God spoke and said, I will give you this land. You'll have to fight for it. You'll have to win it, but I will help you. And he gave them the borders, the north, the south, the east, and the west. You can have all of that if you're willing to fight for it. And they did fight for a while, till they got tired, and they quit before they ever reached the borders. David becomes king, and he decides to finish what God had said they ought to do. He's going to go for the borders, and he expanded the kingdom. He fought for it and made the kingdom great. He also established Jerusalem. If you imagine Jerusalem always belonged to the Jews because it's their city, it didn't always belong to them, not until David. It belonged to a people called the Jebusites. It was a mountain fortress, and David set his sights on it and says, I want that for my people and my God. They said, there's no way you can conquer us. You can't even get in here. And David found a way to get in. He conquered them. And when he took over, he then expanded it, fortified it, built his palace there and lived there. And it became known as the city of David, a symbol of God and his people. You see, David was a man who was great as a king and had a great reign, accomplished much. He also had a great dynasty. Now, you know what a dynasty is? Dynasty is where you have a king who passes the throne to a son, to a grandson, and however many generations, that's his dynasty. Now, King Saul, well, he was one and done. He didn't get to pass it to anybody. Now, back in those days, it wasn't uncommon for a dynasty to go so many generations, but some general decides he ought to be king. He fights against the heir, gets rid of the heir, and he proclaims himself the new king, and now a new dynasty begins. And that was a very common practice, the changing of dynasties, but not with David. God promised David, you'll have an everlasting dynasty, an everlasting kingdom. And thus, when David became king and passed it to his generations, it went all the way to the last king of Israel, the last king before the Babylonian exile. No more kings on the throne after that. All the kings came from David because of the power of God. And yet it really didn't even stop there, because the kingdom of David continued. His genealogy continued on, as the New Testament will show you, until one day in Bethlehem, Jesus Christ was born, a descendant of David. And you remember how the scriptures spoke of Jesus? Mary was told by the angel that your child is going to sit on the throne of his father David. The shepherds were told, go into the city of David, you'll find the Christ, the Lord. And when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the donkey, the crowd yelled, Hosanna to the Son of David. You see, the kingdom of David continued to Jesus and still continues to this day, because David had a great dynasty. You get the idea of what a great king David was, but I got to take you one more direction, though, because this great king was the shepherd king. That's not a coincidence. That's just not a little tidbit. That's actually a big, significant idea, that David was a shepherd king. Now, let's think about how unlikely that is, how exceptional, how odd. Where do kings come from? The household of kings. Sons are raised in the house of their father, the king. They're groomed to one day rise up and become the king. That's where kings come from. That's where all of David's descendants will come from. They'll be raised in the household of David, except not David himself. David was a shepherd boy, the most unlikely person to pick as a king. Even his father Jesse didn't bring him in the house to meet Samuel, because nobody imagined a shepherd boy could become a king. But God could take the smallest of things and make something big out of them, like he did with David. And once he became a king, the Bible writer never lets you forget where he came from. That's why so often in the text it will describe David this way, that David ruled over Israel having been taken from the sheep. Always wanting to remind you where David came from, the shepherd who became a king. Why does that even matter? Because God took that idea and it became a symbol of the kind of leadership that God wants among his people, the shepherd king. The prophets will preach like this. Jesus will talk like this. Paul and the other apostles will teach this as well. The kind of leadership God desires among his people is the shepherd king. So, for example, in the Old Testament days, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel would say to those who lead the people of Israel, be like David and lead like a shepherd over the flock as you rule them. Jesus would speak to his apostles, oh, the people of this world, they lord it over their people, not you. I want you to practice the leadership of a servant who serves his people. And Paul could speak to the elders and tell them, I want you to be pastors, shepherding the flock. To Timothy and Titus and other preachers, I want you to take good care of the flock that God has entrusted you. You see, this is the leadership style all of us in the church who lead are supposed to be exercising, the shepherd king, the shepherd ruler. Even in the home, I recommend it. Parents leading their children, lead them as your flock, and you shepherd them as you lead. That's what we get from David, the shepherd king. Now, what does that shepherd king look like? What kind of leadership is it? It's got several facets that Paul himself explains to us. First, you got to provide pastoral care for your flock. Pastoral care, take care of the flock and their needs. Kind of like what David said in Psalm 23, Lord's my shepherd. He leads me beside still water. He restores my soul. He anoints my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Look at the needs and shepherd and pastor. And so it is those who lead among God's people. You're to pray for your flock and for their needs. You're to nourish your flock with the Word of God, making sure they're healthy in the Word. And as they hurt, you provide a comfort that helps them with their hurts. See, pastoral care is part of being a shepherd king. Also, to protect the flock from danger, like David, who stood between his sheep and a lion and a bear, and with a sling took them down. No wonder he wasn't afraid of a giant. Where he says in Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, because you're with me. Your rod, your staff comfort me. That's what shepherd leaders do. We stand before our people and we protect them from that which could harm them. Think about the lies and the falsehoods, the spiritual hurts as well that we protect them from. Oh, and there's one more thing. You persuade the flock to follow. That's a distinctive thing about shepherd leaders. See, if you're dealing with cattle, you know how a wrangler does it? You get behind the cows, you shoot your gun, make loud noise, crack the whip, and you push them forward. Shepherds don't do that. Shepherds get in front of the flock and say, follow me. And the sheep will follow if they trust the shepherd, the one who has provided care, the one who has protected them. If there is a trust with this person, the sheep follow as the shepherd moves before them. And thus the shepherd steps out in front. He sets the example. He sets the pace. And the sheep follow the leader. That's what God says in His Word. I'd like for all of us to learn how to do as we lead, is to become like David, the shepherd king. Learn how to be a leader who cares for the people you lead, who pastors them, leading like a servant, serving others. You know the greatest one of all, though, the greatest shepherd king? Well, that was Jesus Christ. See, what David was in his imperfect way really was a symbol of what Jesus will be in perfection, because Jesus was the ultimate shepherd, the good shepherd we call him. He was the ultimate King of kings and Lord of lords. And Jesus shows us what it's like to be a strong ruler who loves the people he rules and cares for them and protects them. And that's the story of the shepherd king making its final fulfillment. It's found in Jesus Christ. You see, the David story is a great story. And the Goliath story, that's a lot of fun, but there's so much more to David than just the Goliath story. The more you understand David as king, the more you start to realize what it was that God saw in the heart of that man. What made him so special? What made him great? What made him the model for all of us who want to rise up and lead God's people? Because David was the shepherd king.